things that alerted me to the fact that there was more to know about what's going on in the music game was the proliferation of symbols and imagery that was getting inserted into the work of various A-list artists. One of the best examples would be this pyramid symbol, which we see time and time again cropping up in music videos, record sleeves, promo shots, that sort of thing. This is dating back to 1985, 30 years ago. It's Madonna in the movie Desperately Seeking Susan, and on the back of her jacket we have the pyramid symbol with a capstone and an illuminated capstone with an all-seeing eye in the centre of it. That image is a bit dark, but that's what it is. And isn't it interesting that we saw that symbol crop up in Johann's talk as representing the element of air? It has many other connotations. You're doubtless aware of the fact that the pyramid appears on the back of the US dollar bill with the removed capstone and the all-seeing eye. And you might ask yourself, what connection could an esoteric symbol like that have to the entertainment industry, to a pop artist like Madonna? Which is a very good question to ask. And we're seeing these symbols all over the place, bringing it more up to date. Here's this kind of triangular pyramid symbol being evoked by Jay-Z. There's lots to say about Jay-Z. There's a lot about him in the book, but we'll be here till about 8 o'clock if I start to go into it now. But suffice to say, this is a symbol that you see Jay-Z flashing up all the time, or he used to. And he refers to it as the rock sign. All these symbols come with an innocent-sounding cover story to explain what they are. And Jay-Z will tell you that this is the rock sign, and it's representative of his record label, which, when it first came out, was called Rockefeller Records. There's a name to conjure with. These days, it's morphed into Rock Nation, but the idea behind this symbol is that it represents the bling culture of hip-hop. It's supposed to be a diamond shape. And he's celebrating, you know, the success of his record label and all the rest of it. Jay-Z, in an interview in 2009, claimed to have invented this symbol. But when you look into it, you realise that's not the case. This symbol goes way back into antiquity. It's been used by many different civilizations in many parts of the world. You've seen it used by the Church of Satan, for instance. It's been used by Aleister Crowley in many of his dark occult secret societies, the OTO and the AA and all the rest of it. Very far from a modern symbol. Here he is with his best mate Kanye West doing the same thing. You come to realise there's more than meets the eye here. And again, the question arises, why should these esoteric symbols have any connection to the modern music industry? Talking of the Church of Satan, here's the founding priest of that organisation, Anton Sandor LaVey, doing that very same sign. So straight away we see it goes back a little bit further than 2009. This would have been sometime in the 1960s. Another symbol that seems to be a favourite of these A-list artists is this one that you make with your thumb and fingers. And the cover story for it is that it means, okay, everything's cool, everything's fine. And you see politicians doing this, you see all manner of celebrities doing it. But of course, there's always a different explanation as to what these symbols mean. And when you really get into it and you study the occult nature of it, you realise that this is a depiction of a 6. And when you've got the 3 fingers raised at the top there, it's kind of denoting that it's 6 to the power of 3 or 3 sixes. So it's a depiction of 666. The number of the beast in the Book of Revelation, and so many other dark occult connotations as well. 666 crops up a lot in this story. Why are these artists doing it? And they're not the only ones. As I mentioned, politicians seem to be rather fond of it as well. There's all your favourite ones up there, Rogues Gallery. It's like a nightmare episode of Celebrity Squares, isn't it? Your worst nightmare. And there it is, 666. And that particular number crops up somewhere else in the modern music story as well. Dr. Dre, the hip-hop artist and producer, formerly of NWA, who's enjoyed a highly successful solo career since, and is consistently named as one of the richest individuals in hip-hop, It's worth millions, if not billions now, and much of it has come as a result of his headphone range called Beats by Dre. And it's just a coincidence that Beats is an anagram of beast. We won't go there just now. But one of the symbols for Beats by Dre, the logo, is this symbol here, which we're told is supposed to be a B for Beats. But it looks more like a 6 to me. And in one of the ads for Beats by Dre, you get the 3 6s being flashed up there. And when you look into some of the other stuff that Dr. Dre has been involved with over the years and what he represents, it's no surprise to find him associated with this number. It goes way back. Here's a young Michael Jackson flashing up that same symbol that we saw Beyoncé doing. And here's the first, but not the last, showing of the Beatles in this particular talk. And we've got 2 symbols for the price of 1 here. We've got Paul McCartney, or is it? We're going there too, don't worry. We will get there. I should say, Paul McCartney, doing the 6 thing, and John Lennon here flashing up the horned hand sign. He does it that way around in one picture, and he does it the other way around, saying, I can't do it, I can't do these things. That's it. He does it that way around once, and then for good measure, you get him in another shot doing it that way around. And there's a cover story for this symbol as well. This one is supposed to mean I love you. It's supposed to be spelling out I love you in deaf sign language when you've got the thumb extended like this. I should learn to do these things, I just can't get it right now. But in actual fact, again, when you do the research, you come to realise that these secret societies that control the entertainment industry, these dark occult networks, have this entity known as Baphomet, and often known by other names as well, this horned kind of demonic entity which they seem to revere for some reason. And they seem to want to kind of worship it. And they get their artists to throw up these symbols in a kind of homage to this entity that means so much to them. And so that's why you see so many artists throwing up the horned hand sign. There's a particularly sinister depiction of it here from Eminem. And again, politicians get in on the act. Is it just a coincidence that all this lot had to be throwing up the same symbol? And are Hillary Clinton, Bush, Cheney and Obama the sort of people that you'd really expect to be telling everyone, I love you? Probably not. They might be saying I love you, but it'll be to something other than humans. And here's our old mate Anton LaVey again, showing that this symbol was another favoured one of the Church of Satan, doing exactly the same hand signal there. It's known as Evil Mano Cornuto, the horned hand. And then we have another symbol which crops up time and time again, which is the depiction of one eye symbolism. It, according to which researchers' work you look at, it's taken to be a depiction of the same all-seeing eye that we see in the pyramid. It's taken to be a depiction of the pineal gland, the third eye, so-called, the portal to higher levels of consciousness. But either way, these many artists seem to feel the need to highlight one eye and communicate it to you. And there's pretty much every A-list artist of contemporary times that you can think of in this composite picture doing the one eye symbol. You can ask yourself why this is. It goes way beyond the realms of coincidence. There are actually people that will say, oh, it's just a coincidence, they're just trying to look cool, it's just a trendy thing to do. In all these cases, yeah, right. I think there's more than meets the eye, if you'll forgive the pun. We get it in videos as well, and this one was a classic. This is a composite picture of the video Die Young. It's a lovely song. It basically gives you the sentiments that life is short and pointless, and we're all going to die young anyway, so we might as well go out and get laid and get party and get high, because that's all life is worth. Lovely song. Nice one to get your daughters to listen to. And we have symbolism to match the sentiments of the song. So in this particular video, we had an upside-down cross, the classic inversion of that sacred symbol, which is a tenet of Satanism, which reverses and inverts everything. Then we have a pentagram, which you might expect to have been inverted actually, but they didn't get round to doing that one. And over here, the all-seeing eye at the top of the pyramid again. So 3 symbols for the price of 1. That was an absolute Illuminati symbol fest. That video was just ridiculous. And it's all aimed at the subconscious mind, below the threshold of conscious recognition. So these symbols go straight into the subconscious mind, largely of young people, children, teenagers. And the conscious mind is not aware of the fact that they've been placed there. So in all these cases, we have the control system that is running the show when it comes to the music industry, placing their little calling cards and their little clues in plain sight. They're letting you know who owns these artists, because their asses are owned, lock, stock and barrel. And there's a phrase that you often hear, which is, they've sold their souls for fame and fortune. And I would suggest that rather than that being a myth or a convenient kind of quip or phrase, there is a lot of truth to that statement. This is a still from Rihanna's Run This Town video. And it's one of many images which occurs during a split second. So again, it's aimed at the subconscious mind, which absorbs everything. It absorbs millions of pieces of information per second, which the conscious mind is not capable of recognizing and processing. The conscious mind just selects a few pieces of information that it needs out of the many millions that it takes in, and the rest lay deeply lodged within the subconscious, and they can be called upon at a later date and evoked and brought to the surface without the conscious mind being aware of it. So these images are always aimed at the subconscious, and for a split second you had this image of Rihanna seemingly turning into this kind of entity and just morphing into whatever that is. Again, it's a video which would be watched by kids. Rihanna's fan base is largely young girls, at the age of 8, 9, 10 upwards. Is this appropriate stuff for them to be absorbing? Probably not, but it's there anyway. And here's another still from a Rihanna video. This one is from her song Umbrella, and it appears to be a pose where she's bending down, outstretching her arms, putting her head down. But when you study the dynamics of what's going on here, you realise that this pose cannot anatomically be achieved. It's been digitally manipulated. And it is in fact a depiction of a kind of horned entity. You've got the arms representing the horns there, you've got the eye sockets there above, and then you've got the head representing the snout, and it's deeply disturbing stuff. It's another example of those that are controlling things, placing what they're doing and what they represent in plain sight for those that have got the eyes to see. And you get the eyes to see when this stuff is brought into the realms of the conscious mind, when it's pointed out what they're actually doing. And when it comes out of the subconscious, you can realise that this stuff is going on. And that's the key to not being affected by it, becoming consciously aware of what the game is. I want to move on.
Yeah, here we go.
Thank you. Thanks. I want to move on to an extended section on the phenomenon known as predictive programming. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the term and the concept. This is the way I've broken it down in my upcoming book, just to explain how it works. Predictive programming is the practice of encoding visual clues and symbols into works of popular culture aimed at large audiences which depict a real-world event, should be in there, yet to happen, or currently happening. In recognition of the powerful influence of the subconscious mind on an individual's psyche, images are subtly conveyed in encoded form which foreshadow events which are known to be coming. So it's very real, it goes on all the time, and it's been going on for a very long time. One of the earliest examples of the kind of modern era, if you like, within the last 100 or so years, concerned the Titanic. Or was it? Again, we get into a question of whether the Titanic was actually what we were told it was, or whether it was in fact a ship known as the Britannic, which was swapped, but that's another story. And this is an absolute mind-blower, because there was a novel which came out in 1898 called Futility by a guy called Morgan Robertson, and it detailed the sinking of an unsinkable ship known as the Titan. What were the chances? And there are so many parallels here between this supposedly fictional story and the official story of the Titanic. The two ships had almost identical names. Both were designated unsinkable. They were both the largest ships at sea at the time. They both collided with icebergs in the month of April. Both resulted in many deaths due to a shortage of lifeboats. And both had similar floor plans and technical descriptions. You know, if you accept that this cannot possibly be a coincidence, then you have to accept that whoever creates these works of apparent fiction before a real-world event happens had advanced knowledge of what was to come and was in some way associated with those parties that caused the event to happen the way it did. That's a very early example of it. Let's bring it into contemporary times with 9/11, nice and topical. When you're looking for examples of predictive programming and how it all works, there's no better event to study than 9/11, because there are several hundred examples of various aspects of what came to pass on the 11th of September 2001 in Hollywood movies, TV shows, music videos, cartoons. You can look them up on YouTube and you could be there for weeks. There are hundreds of videos. Some of the videos go on for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and they consist of little snippets of aspects of 9/11 that were foreshadowed by way of predictive programming in the years up to 2001. There was definitely advanced knowledge of what was to pass, and all of those that created these music videos, movies, TV shows, cartoons would have been complicit in what was going to happen. How else could you explain these various aspects? As I say, there are hundreds you can look at. I've just selected a few. This is from the movie Independence Day, where you get a split-second shot of a clock counting down, and in the frame that you get to see in the movie, the clock is saying 9/11/01. So it's got the date right down to the year. In the movie The Matrix, the first Matrix movie, which came out in 1999, you get a shot of the character Neo's passport, and the expiry date on it just happens to be the 11th of September 2001. I've had a lot of synchronicities happening to me in recent weeks, and a lot of them have involved numbers. And I love it when this happens, because it's the universe communicating with you and kind of reaching out to you and connecting with you. So all these examples just fascinate me. And I had one recently because I was putting together this slideshow, and I remembered that date on Neo's passport. And I do a day job, because there ain't too much money in telling the truth. Don't know if you've noticed. So you kind of have to find other ways to pay the bills. And I do a driving job. I drive people to and from airports, basically. Glorified taxi. And I had to, unfortunately, get licensed by the local council in order to do the job. And when my license came through, you can imagine my shock when the expiry date on it just happened to be the 11th of September, 2017. And I didn't even spot it at first. I had that badge for a few weeks. I was putting this presentation together and nearly lost my mind when I saw that. That's an aside anyway. I'm not part of the plot, really. So I mentioned cartoons are in on the act as well, and here was an episode of The Simpsons foreshadowing 9/11. Bart's looking at this comic with a picture of the Manhattan skyline with the Twin Towers there. It's $9. The 9 matches up with the 11. You've got New York at the top. There you go. Classic 9/11 predictive programming. This was in the late 90s, I believe, running up to 2001. A few other examples from cartoons. We have Spider-Man, we have Iron Man with a depiction of a plane going into the Pentagon. We'll get into that Supertramp record sleeve in a minute. Sesame Street, all sorts. And there's the years as well, going way back. In terms of music releases, bringing it back to the music industry, Jay-Z, I told you there'd be more about him, released his classic album, The Blueprint, on what date? At the top there. This is an Amazon entry for the album, and it turns out that of all the dates that could have been picked, it just happened to be September 11th, 2001. And bear in mind, the album was called The Blueprint. Then we had, a few years earlier, in 1997, an album from Michael Jackson, and it was called Blood on the Dance Floor. I think there's probably some Masonic lodge connotations going on there, particularly as he's dancing on a black and white checkerboard floor, representing the duality of light and dark, and good and evil, and base consciousness. It's the floor that you get in Masonic temples. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. And in the background you have a city skyline that looks quite similar to Manhattan crumbling into dust. And we've got some nice Saturn imagery going on there with the blood red colours. Busta Rhymes produced a whole bunch of albums in the 90s that all had this kind of disaster, doom-laden, apocalyptic overtone to them. He put out one called When Disaster Strikes. This one was called Extinction Level Event. And again, you get a city skyscape which looks very similar to Manhattan, and it's going up in flames, and there's absolute chaos and carnage everywhere. And that to me looks very much like a depiction of what would come to pass on 9/11 in a Busta Rhymes album. This one is even more blatant, and it dates to June 2001. So it's only a few weeks before the events of 9/11 actually happened. And it's a little-known hip-hop act called The Coup. And you've got the two members down the front here, in front of the Twin Towers, which are depicted as exploding in exactly the same way that we saw in the footage of September 11th. And this guy here, the front man of the group, has what seems to be some sort of remote control device, and he's pressing a button as if to trigger the explosion. And needless to say, when the events of 9/11 happened, there was a lot of controversy and outrage about this particular sleeve, and there were a lot of questions asked as well about how it was that these guys had put out a sleeve that foreshadowed what was to come to pass. It was swiftly taken off the market and replaced by another sleeve, but the question remains, how did they have foreknowledge that this was going to come to pass in exactly the way it was depicted on the sleeve? It's one of so many examples. And we're now going back to 1979, and this one's an absolute classic. If anyone had any doubts up to this point that there was foreknowledge involved, if anyone was content to put it all down to coincidence and just one of those things, I would invite them to debunk this one. So you've got the group Supertramp, the British rock group, and they put out an album in 1979 called Breakfast in America. And on the sleeve you have a view from an aeroplane window looking out as the plane comes in over the Manhattan skyline. You've got the Twin Towers there, which was still standing at that point, of course, and you've got the waitress, and you've got the word Supertramp over the top of the skyline. Researchers are very vigilant these days, particularly in the age of the internet, and nothing gets missed. Whenever there's a very obscure kind of clue placed into a work of popular culture, it will get noticed by somebody. I've no idea how the person concerned worked this one out, but somebody realised that if you reverse the image and make a mirror reflection of it, something very interesting happens. Where you had the word Supertramp over the top, above the Twin Towers, you now have a 9 and an 11 formed from the word Supertramp. And bear in mind that we're viewing this from an aeroplane window. Somebody must have worked really hard to get that logo to fit so that when it's reversed, it spells out in that way. That one would have gone straight into the subconscious mind of anyone seeing that sleeve. They would possibly have been able to understand what it meant, but nevertheless, it was lodged in the subconscious psyche, and it was another example of them announcing what they were going to do, telling us about it. When we get to the second half of this, I'm going to give you my ideas on why they do this, why they feel the need to tell us about it, albeit in deeply encoded, cryptic form like this. Just before we move on from the 9/11 stuff and keeping it relevant to the music industry, there were a lot of references to the year 2001 in the run-up to it. What should have been so interesting about this particular year? You might think that the year 2000 would be one that was evoked in earlier works, given that it was the start of the millennium. But it wasn't. It was always 2001. Dr. Dre, back again, put out an album in 1999, which he chose to call 2001. Nobody could really understand why it was called 2001 when it came out at the end of 1999, but when you factor in the events of 9/11 and you see how it's connected to the key players in the music industry, it would appear to be another reference to what was to come, in this case, giving you the year. And you've got to wonder about what inside knowledge there was between Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke when they came up with the incredible, iconic movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. For some reason, when this story was composed in the 1960s, 2001 was chosen as the year in the future in which the events of this story would take place. It could have been any year, but 2001 was chosen. Stanley Kubrick is a fascinating guy to study. There's so much truth encoded in his films. There's so much esoteric symbolism that you can get into. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Kubrick was, if not a kind of fully paid up member of what people call the Illuminati or the secret society networks, then he was certainly in possession of knowledge of how they operate. And it's not inconceivable that he would have had some knowledge of what the plan was with regards to 9/11 all those years later in 2001 when he put together this incredible movie. 2001 again, here's one that nobody has been able to explain to me in terms of giving it a plausible explanation. Prince, the artist Prince, did a concert in December 1998, and towards the end of the show, you can get this on YouTube, you can hear the actual footage of it. He said, "We got one more, then we've got to get out. I've got to go home, y'all. I've got to go home to America. I've got to go get ready for the bombs." Osama bin Laden getting ready to bomb, yeah. Now, if he'd left it at that, bearing in mind this was December 1998, and Osama bin Laden had already been blamed for the Oklahoma city bombing and various other outrages, you could have said, oh, it's just a reference to the fact that bin Laden was this familiar terrorist figure of the time. But then he goes on to add, 2001 hit me in December 98. Why would that be? A few more examples of predictive programming before we move on to the second part of this presentation, which is where I get into some more metaphysical and esoteric concepts. This one is from a video by the rapper, so-called, I beg to differ, Lil Wayne, and it's from his wonderful song, My Home Is Still. That's the one that contains the line, "These hoes love me like Satan, man." So, nice family-friendly stuff. Another one for your kids. I don't know why the hoes would love Satan in the first place, but apparently they do. So here he is, in this video, in a movie theatre, surrounded by 12 skeletons. You can count them, there's 12 there, trust me. And this video came out just a few days before a lone nutter, we all know about these lone nutters, don't we, burst into a movie theatre in Aurora, Colorado, and started shooting up the place. And the official version of the story tells you that 12 people just happened to die in that movie theatre at the time. And it was during a showing of the Batman movie, The Dark Knight. So a few days before that, we get Little Wayne, and for no apparent reason, there's no connection here to what goes on in the song. He's in this movie theatre with 12 skeletons. And one of the things about predictive programming is when they're showing you a depiction of something which is yet to come, it doesn't matter whether the event in question is genuine or whether it's a bogus, bullshit, false flag hoax, because most of them are. It doesn't matter that they're trying to get you to believe the official story of a false flag hoax or a false flag terror event such as 9/11. The important thing is that they're getting aspects of what is to come planted in the subconscious mind of the general public so that when the official story comes out, it's more readily accepted and there's familiarity already there through elements of it that you've already seen. We all know about chemtrails and geoengineering, don't we? We do now, anyway. Not many people knew about it in 1984, but whoever was behind this particular episode of Doctor Who on the BBC, that nice organisation, and there's a whole chapter on them in my book. We won't go into them today. Nobody mentioned Jimmy Savile. Back in 1984, there was an episode of Doctor Who called The Caves of Androzani, and there was a character in it known as Morgus, and at a point in the dialogue, he says, "As they used to say on Earth, every cloud has a strontium lining." And when you get into studying chemtrails, geoengineering, you hear that strontium is one of the metal nanoparticles that are present in these trails that we're getting, which is so damaging to human health. Isn't it interesting that over 30 years ago, there was this sly reference to it in an episode of Doctor Who? That may be an innocent throwaway line, but it may not. If it's not, why was it there? Again, it has no connection to the plot of the show. Yeah, there's a couple missing here, actually. Yeah, we'll go straight to this one. We get into the moon landing hoax. Johan touched on this earlier. The Apollo moon landings, which I think we would probably pretty much agree didn't happen the way we're told they did. But again, that doesn't matter because they were just trying to get you to believe the official version of the story. And there was a very interesting point in the James Bond film Diamonds Are Forever, which came out in 1971. So that would be 2 years after the first Apollo moon landing. And you get this section of the film where Sean Connery as Bond is in this underground kind of military research facility in the middle of the Nevada desert, which sounds very similar to what we hear about Area 51. And there's one point where he's trying to escape from the bad guys, and he runs across what appears to be a rigged up film set of astronauts walking on the moon. And he's running across this set trying to get away from the villains. And you've got these two astronauts, and because they're in moonwalk mode, they're trying to get him, but they're walking in slow motion like they're on the moon. And it appears to be a direct piss take of the rigged up false hoax moon landings that happened a couple of years before. It seems to me like the makers of this James Bond film were kind of letting us know that it was a hoax, and they're just having a bit of a laugh with it. And I doubt very many people at the time realised the significance of it. But once again, they're telling you what they did. In this case, rigged the whole thing up on a film set. We have a couple of more recent examples of predictive programming as well. You might remember in March of this year, there was a terrible plane crash, at least as far as we're told, where a Germanwings plane came down over the French Alps. It was on its way from, I think it was Barcelona to Germany, and we're told that the co-pilot, who was psychotic and depressed, engineered an opportunity to get the pilot out of the cockpit, he barricaded himself into the cockpit, and then he deliberately flew the plane into the ground, killing everyone on board. That's the official line of that story. There was a movie which came out a few weeks before, isn't it always the case? This one was called Wild Tales, and it was an Argentinian movie. There were 6 separate plot lines, little short stories in it. In one of them, there was a guy who was an airline pilot who decided to get revenge on a bunch of people in his life that he didn't like, that had wronged him in some way. I think it was a former wife or girlfriend or something, wanted to get even with her. There was a business partner that had stiffed him on a deal, so he wanted to, get him. And he invited all these people on board a flight. And at an opportune moment during the flight, he barricaded himself into the cockpit and flew the flight into the ground, killing everyone on board. And then a few weeks after that, we get this story in the news. Every time there's a major world event that you will see on your nightly news bulletins or read about in the mainstream press, there is a work of popular culture, fiction, whether it's a movie, whether it's a music video, whether it's a cartoon, that will have depicted some aspect of what came to pass. Every time. They don't miss any. Every time they tell you what they're going to do. And if you hunt hard enough, you can always find the examples of it. There was this disgusting movie, Kingsman, The Secret Service, that came out earlier this year. And it came out round about the time that we're told this guy, Dylan Roof, went on the rampage in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and shot up the congregation of largely African Americans. Just before that happened, in this movie, Kingsman, we get Colin Firth's character, who's a Secret Service agent, who, in a mind-controlled state, goes into a church and starts slaughtering the entire congregation. He shoots them, he stabs them, beats them over the head with whatever. It's presented in a comedy kind of way. They're trying to make light of this and make the violence fun in the movie. Making massacres fun. But nevertheless, it seems to be yet another example of what was to come to pass in the Charleston church shooting. Going way back to the Beatles, I told you we'd get there. Let's get into Paul is Dead, shall we? The theory that the real Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by an imposter who's been taking his place ever since. I know it sounds ridiculous when you first hear it, and it sounds impossible, but I've done a lot of research into this theory, as have many other authors and researchers. There's a book by Jim Fetzer called And I Suppose We Didn't Go to the Moon Either. I think Ule Damagard was involved in that book as well, which examines various so-called conspiracy theories. And in the book is a collection of essays from different researchers, all focusing on this idea that the guy we think of today as Paul McCartney is not the real deal. I've come to understand that the corporate music industry is very much steeped in dark occult practices. It is unfortunately very much steeped in sacrifice from time to time, human sacrifice. I know it sounds outrageous, but there is evidence to support this. And as we've seen, it loves its symbolism and it loves conveying aspects of what it's doing or what it's done to the general public, in the knowledge that most people won't be able to see it. Most people will not understand. Only a few ever will. And I think, as do many others, that there were many aspects relating to the replacement of Paul McCartney that were put into the works of the Beatles. There are two theories as to what happened. The conventional one is that Paul McCartney got into an argument with the other Beatles early one morning after a recording session in London. And he jumped into his convertible sports car and sped off through the streets of London, and he was involved in a tragic, fateful accident in which he was near decapitated and killed instantly. And then the official version of this story goes that Brian Epstein, the manager of the Beatles, and the others in the group, and those that were controlling the Beatles, panicked at the loss of the key member of the group, and they worked very quickly to find somebody to take his place. That version of the story does seem a little implausible to me, because it does depend on there being someone available that wasn't doing anything for the next 50 or 60 years, you know, that was happy to step into McCartney's shoes and play the part of him. I think it's far more feasible that there was some time taken before this replacement was introduced. There was a period in which whoever it was that took the place of McCartney was able to train up for the role and prepare for it. There was probably some element of changing his appearance, plastic surgery and such. And it seems far more likely in that event that the real Paul McCartney was deliberately taken out for whatever reason. And this was known about for some time before it actually happened, to allow for the replacement to come in. But nevertheless, there are many symbolic clues as to what happened. The sleeve of the Abbey Road album is one which is constantly cited as letting you know what went on. This came out in 1969. You got the four Beatles in various garb there, and it's supposed to represent McCartney, who is barefooted in a loose-fitting suit, as a corpse. It's supposed to represent a funeral procession, with John Lennon in white as the priest, with Ringo in black as the Undertaker, and George Harrison in jeans as the Undertaker. That's supposed to be the symbology of this picture. And it's interesting that McCartney is holding a cigarette in his right hand there, when the real Paul McCartney is on record as having been left-handed. From 1966 onwards, McCartney suddenly became right-handed.
Wow.
There were more clues in the sleeve to Sgt. Pepper, the classic Beatles album. Many of them in there, but again, this album sleeve is taken to represent a funeral, with the original Beatles kind of being laid to rest, and the new version of the Beatles being introduced to the world. Lots of clues in the lyrics to some of those songs as well, particularly when it comes to the introduction of the character Billy Shears, who is taken by the majority of researchers to be the person that took over the place of McCartney. And then you get into all kinds of forensic evidence when it comes to the pre-1966 McCartney and the version of him post-1966 that we've all come to accept as Paul McCartney. Because, you know, you'd have to have been around a pretty long time to have any recollection of the Paul McCartney that the world saw before 1966. Most of us in this room have only ever known the guy that came along after that date. All kinds of forensic evidence, as I say, to suggest that a switch took place. The most convincing for me is simply the height of the post-1966 McCartney. So on the left here, you've got a picture of the real James Paul McCartney with his girlfriend Jane Asher, sometime in the 1960s, and you can see they're pretty much the same height, more or less. Then you have a picture from post-1966, again with Jane Asher, but this time you see towering above her, quite a bit taller. Is that the same guy? There are some interesting things about the year 1966, just as there were with 2001, the 35-year gap between them. But there's a lot of significance in this story, I feel, to 1966. I don't know if the two sixes, the 66, are connected to the 666 that we saw earlier on, but either way, there's a lot of occult, kind of dark occult relevance to 66. That was the year in which Anton LaVey established the Church of Satan, which was kind of a front group interface for celebrities of the day. There were many celebrity members of the Church of Satan, including Jane Mansfield and Sammy Davis Jr. back in the day. More recently, Marilyn Manson. Mark Almond of Soft Cell is a member of it. There was the movie Rosemary's Baby, which is probably the most chilling film ever made. You know, it's far more scary than The Omen or The Exorcist for me, because from what I've been able to establish, there's a lot of truth to the narrative of what goes on in this movie. It's actually about this young couple that move into an apartment building in New York, which just happens to be the Dakota building, outside which John Lennon was murdered. And the guy is a wannabe actor. He's an up-and-coming actor, but he's not having much success. And he falls in with this network of Satanists who offer to give him the fame and the fortune and the success that he craves, but there is a heavy price to pay. And if that's not an allegory for what really goes on in the entertainment industry, then I don't know what is. This movie was directed by Roman Polanski, a big-time insider when it comes to knowledge of how these things all work. The interesting thing about it is this movie, which as I said is all about networks of Satanists, came out in 1968, but it was set in 1966. And you see a calendar on the wall stating that it's 1966, and one of the lead Satanist characters in it states, this is year one. So it's the year that the Church of Satan was established. It's described as year one in the movie Rosemary's Baby, as if it's the countdown to something, or, you know, it's significant in some way. I came to find out that construction of the World Trade Center Twin Towers commenced in 1966. And there are many researchers that believe these towers were specifically constructed with the intent of them being brought down in that massive dark occult ritual that was 9/11, 35 years later. We have another link there between 1966 and 2001. Lastly, before we move on to the second part of the presentation, this is the Georgia Guidestones. I'm sure many are familiar with them. They are said to contain a number of, it's basically a wish list, a bucket list of the elite controllers, so-called, in terms of the things that they want to achieve in human society, their grand plan. And the most famous of them is their wish for massive population reduction. The first tenet on these granite guidestones is maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. And it appears to be another example of them telling you what they plan to do. So let's move on. The connections between what I've just presented and what I'm about to will hopefully become clear as we progress.